It feels more together. It's been a really positive step for us. We have cleared a little bit the midfield, let's say.
Listen, guys, something massive just happened in Miami, and if you missed it, you are seriously sleeping on the biggest story of this F1 weekend. Red Bull was written off, Max was struggling, people were calling the RB22 a disaster, and then Miami happened. Suddenly, the car feels alive, the upgrades are hitting different, and Verstappen is back at the sharp end looking dangerous. But here is the twist. Even after all of this, Max himself is saying the car is still not where he wants it. So what exactly is going on? Because today, we are breaking down everything. The practice heroics, the sprint qualifying drama, the rain fear, and Max's war against these 2026 regulations that he absolutely cannot stand. The lion wakes up. So, let's start from the very beginning of the Miami weekend, because Friday practice told us everything we needed to know. Charles Leclerc topped the session for Ferrari, which was impressive, but honestly, the more interesting story was who was sitting right behind him in second place. Max Verstappen, just 0.3 off the pace. Now, for context, in the previous races this season, Red Bull was over a second behind the leaders. A full second, that is an eternity in Formula One. So to come to Miami and suddenly be fighting right at the front in practice, that was a statement. And it was not just luck either, because Red Bull brought serious upgrades to Miami, including their own version of Ferrari's rotating rear wing, the so-called Macarena wing, which Max had actually been testing at Silverstone before the weekend. The car was visibly more competitive, and you could feel the energy shifting in the Red Bull garage. Max was finally starting to look like the Verstappen we all know. Sprint qualifying, P5, and a wild moment. Now, coming off that strong practice, the momentum carried into sprint qualifying, and Max delivered again. He finished 5th overall, which might not sound like headline news, but when you look at who he beat, George Russell and Lewis Hamilton, it starts to make a lot more sense. He was genuinely mixing it with the top teams again, and Red Bull was no longer buried in the midfield. But here is where it gets spicy, because sprint qualifying was not without drama for Max. During the session, there was a moment in the pit lane where Verstappen squeezed right past Franco Colapinto in a very tight and uncomfortable-looking moment that definitely raised a few eyebrows. It was the kind of incident that reminded everyone just how intense and aggressive Max can be, even when it is just a qualifying session. The competitive instinct never switches off with this guy, and honestly, that is exactly why we watch him. Still not where I want it to be, Max keeps it real. Here's the thing that makes Verstappen different from most drivers. He never sugarcoats anything. After sprint qualifying, when everyone around him was celebrating the progress, Max sat in front of the cameras and said exactly what was on his mind. He said the car feels more together now, more normal to drive, and that they have almost halved the gap to the leaders compared to previous races. That sounds great, right? But in the very next breath, he admitted the car is still not where he wants it to be, and that Red Bull remains very weak in the high-speed first sector. He was happy with the step forward, but he was not satisfied. And that hunger is exactly what makes him dangerous going into the sprint race in the main Grand Prix. Because a slightly happier but still hungry Max Verstappen is probably the most threatening version of him on any given weekend. The rain concern. Max spots something nobody else did. Now, while everyone was talking about the weather forecast for Sunday's race, and yes, thunderstorms were genuinely threatening to shut the whole Grand Prix down due to a US law around lightning, Max went one step further than the other drivers. Most of them were talking about the electrical power being too high in wet conditions, or the tire blanket temperatures needing adjustment. Max agreed with all of that, but then raised a completely separate concern that nobody else had mentioned: the drainage. He pointed out that Miami's parking lot area has very poor drainage, and that last year during the sprint weekend, there was serious standing water building up on parts of the circuit before the race even started. He was basically saying that even if the rain looks manageable, the surface around this track holds water in a way that could make things genuinely dangerous. That level of detail and awareness is why Max is so respected, even by the people who disagree with everything he says about the regulations. Max versus the 2026 rules. The war continues. And speaking of the regulations, let's talk about something that has been running all season long: Because Max Verstappen has been at war with the 2026 rules since before the first race even happened. He called the racing a joke after China, said it feels like playing Mario Kart because drivers boost past each other and then immediately run out of battery and get passed straight back. He even joked that he swapped his simulator for a Nintendo Switch to practice Mario Kart instead. Classic Max. But underneath all the humor, he is making a very serious point that these rules are fundamentally flawed, that the racing product is being damaged, and that small tweaks will not fix what is a broken foundation. When the FIA announced regulation changes for Miami, Max called them a tickle, just a tickle. He acknowledged they help qualifying feel slightly more normal, but said the race itself would not be much different. And honestly, given what we have seen so far this season, it is hard to completely disagree with him. Red Bull's Miami upgrade, the turning point? What makes all of this even more interesting is what the Miami upgrades actually represent for Red Bull as a team. This was not just a small tweak here and there. This was a significant package designed to close the gap that had been growing since the start of the season. The Macarena wing alone was a big statement, showing that Red Bull are willing to copy and adapt the best ideas from their rivals in order to find performance. And it worked. The gap to the leaders came down dramatically in just one weekend. Now the real question is whether this is a one-off boost or the beginning of a genuine comeback. Because if Red Bull can keep building on this momentum going into Canada and Monaco, the championship picture could look very different by the summer. Max is starting to find his rhythm again, the car is starting to respond, and the timing could not be more interesting. What happens next? So, to bring it all together, Miami was genuinely a turning point weekend for Max Verstappen and Red Bull. From a strong P2 in practice to a solid P5 in sprint qualifying, from the rain drainage warning that nobody else thought of, to the ongoing battle against regulations he believes are ruining Formula One, there was never a dull moment when Max is involved. Personally, I think Max is right about the regulations. The racing looks exciting on the surface, but when you understand what is actually happening, the boost and harvest cycle does feel artificial. And here's the question I want to leave you with. If Red Bull continues to close this gap with upgrades and Max starts consistently fighting at the front again, do you think he will stay and finish his contract? Or will the regulation frustration push him out of Formula One earlier than anyone expects? Drop your answer in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think, and I will see you in the next one.